Osrith took Tag to the northeastern wall, which was blackened, but was still holding up. Alma. Osrith called, and was sure she got a reply, faintly and unintelligibly. Tail this. Tag demanded, thrusting his seeks into her hand before using the pommel of his sword to throw his weight against the wood. Holding his hand to his face, Osrith could see that the flames were channeling upwards, towards the converging roof beams and spire. Closer to the ground, bodies huddled, and Tag began to push himself along the mud floor, slushy and dense, for the heat of the fire had softened the ground. No! Osrith screamed, as flames licked around him. But, she had been determined to go in, if she could have got in, earlier. She used the seeks to hack at the wood, a frustratingly slow process. At the northwest wall of the church, Osrith could see that Fergus and Drest were making a similar gain, and there was, amazingly, movement from the bodies who had bundled themselves up on the ground against the inferno. And, as she was ready to pull out any persons that Tag may get out, chipping away the woodwork, a kick came to her legs, sweeping her down into the mud. "You bitch!" The words were shouted behind her, and another kick came to her stomach. Osrith groaned at the pain, nearly toppling into the flames but managed to roll away, reaching for Buet. It was the abbot, with whom Griogr had conversed and whose name Omar had cursed. Osrith scrambled to her feet, and shot at him, anger and outrage overcoming her as she attacked him. How dare he be complicit in the deaths of so many people? Why do it? What for? It didn't take long to pound the man's face with tagged seeks, before launching Buet into his stomach, giving him a far more humane death than he had given the poor people inside that devastated building. The flames seemed to be getting worse and, stepping over the dead abbot, she shrieked for tagged, hacking at the raging building as the south side of it cracked and crumbled. Osrith ran back, clutching her head. The devastation was appalling. Yet, to the north, Drest and Phelim had managed to drag people from the church. Behind them, the battle continued as men screamed into attack, the battle cries of the Gales and the Cymrec shattering the air. Osrith, about to strike at the church again, turned to look. And there was Griogr. Griogr was standing between the burning church, which was, against the odds, being liberated of its captives, and the woods. His face, splattered with blood and mud, turned downwards and looked at the abbot, before returning his furious face to her. It was Osrith who began the fight, running at her abuser, Buet raised. Though he was clearly intending to fight her, Domhnall's traitor was taken aback at her ferocious initiation of the conflict. He misstepped backwards as Osrith roared her battle anger at him, striking a chest blow, which he parried badly, driving his own sword under Osrith's arm, tearing into her jerkin, and drew it back, carving a hole into her flesh. "You bitch!" he screamed at her. "I will take your tits." But, Osrith didn't hear him, and anyway, even if she had, she would not have responded. It was a waste of energy. Instead, as Sainid had taught her, she ducked under his arm, lunging for his back, swiping with tagged seeks across the back of his ribs. Griogr howled, thrusting his blade backwards, which missed one leg, but plunged into the inside of her thigh. "Don't kill him," Osrith thought to herself. "Give him to Domhnall, make him face his betrayal." With all her might, Osrith plunged her sword towards Griogr's own legs, slicing up into the hamstring. Those legs that trapped her against that wall. Those hands that explored her intimate flesh. That head which enjoyed humiliating her. Griogr fell, Osrith's blow incapacitating him as he fell to his knees. But he was not finished yet. Pulling at Osrith, Griogr caught her leg, toppling her onto him. Osrith could see he had positioned his sword point upwards and she was falling towards it. She twisted away, landing on his arm, and he pulled her towards him in a stranglehold. "If you only had come to me that night, you could have been queen of this whole country. As it is." Osrith saw him raise the sword, aiming at her chest. But, she was not beaten yet. Throwing her head and shoulders up, she used her elbow to slam into his stomach. It was enough. Winding Griogr had caused him to puff, and stop his fatal blow, and Osrith rolled into the mud. Her own chest and stomach ached, but Osrith forced herself up. Grioghair was trying to get up too, but Osrith was quicker and she felt for tagged Sikhs, plunging it into any available flesh she could find. Grioghair screamed as the blade pierced his left wrist, leaving him pinned to the ground. With buoy, she severed his right hand. Osrith panted, choking on the acrid snoke. At a slower pace, people were still being brought from the church, and she could see Fergus, his hair now black from soot rather than its flame-red hue, and Phelim's men bending to help out those trapped. The church now resembled a heathen offering, burning wood with the human bodies inside. Amma! Osrith called, still covering the agonized Grioghair with her sword. Warrior! The monk called back. He stumbled towards Osrith. We couldn't save everyone, he panted, sweat making white lines through his soot-coated face. If it wasn't for you. Osrith shook her head. Guard this man. She looked down at Grioghair, who was still writhing in agony, spitting incomprehensible words at Osrith. He is a traitor to the king, he is a traitor to his country. She paused, catching her breath. He set fire to the church and ran. Amma looked down at Grioghair, who appeared to be trying to deny everything. I saw him. I saw him throw a flaming rag into your church. And the floor had been soaked with oil by Abbot Jairim, Amma added, grimly. Made out it was an accident. Then you see why this ... man needs to be kept incapacitated until the battle is won. Indeed, boy, Amma agreed, and, as Osrith drew back, the monk stepped into her place. At once, Grioghair attempted to protest. Amma leaned across to him, and Osrith thought he was trying to listen to Grioghair's words. Instead he stamped his iron-nailed boot heavily onto Grioghair's face with a satisfying crunch. The traitor's screams ebbing from her ears, Osrith ran from the site of the former church. She needed to get back to the battlefield, to find Domhnall, to aid her king if the day was not already won. And, by the sounds of the clashing metal and men's cries of attack or in death agonies, it was still going. She emerged to a field of dead and dying, as Domhnall and many men fought on. To the west, Eochaid was screaming for men to join him and continue the fight, but from the edge of the woods, Osrith could not see more men for Eochaid. It took a few moments for Osrith to realize he was calling to Domhnall's crew within and any Cymric who had turned from him. Daichul Chataf? Tvidinian. None. None came. Any who might still be standing of those races did not acknowledge the call. Around them, the Norse were quitting the field, dragging away their dead and retreating into the forest. Men who had been fighting them tore after them in pursuit. Again, Eochaid called. But after a few moments of no response, and the king of Strathclyde charged the field in anger, his target, Domhnall. But, a fight never came. Behind the king of the Strathclyde Cymri, Constantine was holding the point of his sword. Over the dirt and blood and shit and mud he marched their cousin, forcing him upon his knees before Domhnall. She ran to the field, looking around. Eochaid's men were standing around now, those who had fought for him raising their swords in surrender. Osrith raised buoy as a warrior ran to her. He threw off his helmet, his face red with sweat that was dripping into his long black hair. It was Domhnall. The Irish prince grinned at her in triumph as Osrith lowered her sword, the one put up by him at Tara, which she had earned. We won, Osrith. He panted, loudly by her ear. And you are here. Domhnall remains king? We won. He embraced her to him, the battle triumph flowing through him, clapping her on the back, and she held him for a minute, sighing deeply with exhaustion. They'd won. Against the odds, Domhnall was still king. And she was there, not holed up in Eothwick as the political wife of the king of Cumbraland. Behind them a cry went up. Osrith turned out of Domhnall's arms to see it was the monk, Brother Amma, followed by warriors who had rescued the heartbreakingly few victims from the burning church. Osrith looked at Fergus, then followed the line, until she got to the survivors, before tracing her eye again. Something was wrong. But she had no time to think what. For Amma had brought Grioghair, handless and bleeding at his wrist, his face bloody from the kicking he had received. He, too, was forced down before Domhnall, throwing tagged Sikhs into the mud beside him. I am no traitor. Grioghair spat, congealed blood escaping his lips. Eochaid, beside him, bowed his head. Domhnall. Osrith whispered, for the hushed arena of battle had fallen dormant still. Grioghair ... He confessed he murdered King Constantine's father. Domhnall clapped both hands on her shoulders and looked carefully into Osrith's face. You are certain? Yes. And he told the abbot true that he sought the throne, not as kingmaker to Eochaid, but alone. Domhnall slowly removed his hands from Osrith, his face solemn. Then, he strode across to the king. As prince in exile, as Domhnall and Constantine had been, his status was no better than a lord. But he stood before Domhnall, and repeated, loudly, and clearly, what she had said. And a cold feeling of shock shivered through Osrith as Constantine and Domhnall looked across to her, giving her an imperceptible nod. They knew. They knew about Girica's Grioghair. There was no astonishment in their features at Domhnall's news, no amazement. They merely turned back to Grioghair, on his knees with Ummo behind him. And, from the battlefield stalked Ruairi Cambuleach, who had fought with Domhnall that day and had come all the way from Glenorchy with him. The chief of the Cambuleach stood beside Domhnall and said the same. Wordlessly, Domhnall withdrew his short knife from his hip scabbard, hidden under his cloak. In the ebbing light of the day, light photons bounced off its polished surface as the king handed it to Constantine. Constantine looked over the blade, then down to Grioghair, raising the knife over his head. It was his father, Osrith thought. Any second now, he was about to avenge him. But then he stopped, offering his hands, clutched around the hilt, back to Domhnall. Taking back the blade, Domhnall ran it into Grioghair's stomach. With a thump, the traitor fell to the ground, mud splattering up from his impact. Domhnall took the blade, and on his blue cloak, cleaned the weapon. Here falls a traitor, a murderer of the innocent. Domhnall declared, addressing the field. This day is won. He turned to Eochaid, making sure his voice could be heard by all, and Osrith imagined the king of Strathclyde, now kneeling in supplication, and how the slave Guthard Harthknutson, now King Guthard, must have knelt to him. I will not slay my cousin, king in his own right of the Strathclyde Cymru. I reach out to Eochaid to approach me as Alpin kin. All waited. And then, Eochaid opened his mouth. As kin of Sained Mac Alpin, first king of Alba, I cede, and offer true and unwavering loyalty to you, Domhnall Mac Corstin. A cheer erupted around them. Domhnall's men waved swords, shields, arms in the air. This is a day for celebration. The murder of King has been avenged. My cousin has ceded the day and we have routed the Norse. The cheer was raised again, hearty and prolonged, and the king beckoned to the warriors. Domhnall's triumphant forces gathered around the king as Domhnall offered his arm to Eochaid. Osrith watched as Eochaid paused for a moment, before wrapping his hand around Domhnall's forearm and the king around his cousin's. Domhnall then stepped forward, calling to the men, survivors who had been on the opposing sides that day. Come, men of Strathclyde, my people. For this is a day your king welcomes you to his side. He glanced ahead, at the place where the Norse had fought and fled. His presence radiated around the battlefield, and Osrith marveled at Domhnall's presence, charismatic, just, easy to give your loyalty to. If she would but know it, Osrith would compare him to another, yet unborn king next to who she would stand on a battlefield. We, the men of Alba together, whether of Strathclyde, he nodded at Eochaid, of Pitland, at Phelim, of Dulrieter. Together, the Norse will never take hold of this land, will never overrun it as the Danes have in the lands to the south. And then, his eyes met Osrith. 1,000 years passed between them in a second. Then Domhnall, king of Alba, nodded to her very briefly. Osrith's heart soared. Her lord had accepted her. All thought that she had been disloyal by escaping Caeligwil. It flew from her mind. She looked about her, to Umma, to the dead being moved from the field for burial by the fortress's servants, to the line of injured being assisted, or carried for help. She could feel her face grow hot as adrenaline blushed her cheeks. She could find tagged, ask Domhnall's permission for them to wed, be with him, always. Then she saw Umma stride towards a line of people. Nuanced, dressed, and Fergus, all black with soot particles, were escorting them, her heart lurching. The survivors were so few. 3 dozen went in. Barely 10 stood between the warriors, some supporting one another as crossed to them. Then, she looked across at their number again, trying to work out the obvious error. "Boy!" The shout came from the as Osrith scanned the line again. He brandished the Sikhs, tagged Sikhs, which had pinioned Griogir to the ground. "Your Sikhs." Tagged Sikhs, Osrith thought, as the monk thrust it out to her. She smiled, looking at the warriors again. Fergus, now a black-haired Gael, looked away from her. He seemed not surprised to see her, and yet, he had looked away. "You fought with bravery for one so young? Who is your lord, boy?" asked Alba. "Girl." The voice behind her made her turn. "And she is King Domnall's warrior." It was Sainid. Blood and mud was dried in clumps in his hair. It stuck to his armor and legs. Yet, his face was light and alive with mirth. Osrith felt her heart light as air. "We won," she declared. "Indeed," he replied. He looked past Osrith as Alba began to lead away the village survivors. A cold wind blew around them as the monk ushered them to come to the monastery. "And you go to meet the other survivors?" Osrith proposed. But Alba did not reply. No others survived. Sainid's hands took her shoulders. Osrith turned to face him. "But..." Sainid leaned towards her, as the image of Tagged fighting with all his might to enter the inferno. His words were quieter, and she strained to hear over the noise of armor over newly freezing earth. "Did you no hear me, lass?" "No one." "Oh." That was all Osrith could say. "Oh." The battle was over and she was exhausted. Osrith stepped wearily towards the king's general. She put her head on his chest and head on his shoulder and, still standing, closed her eyes, too tired to move, too sad to cry.